All right, hello there. This is Jesse Johnson from Tutoring with a Twist, and I'm going to be continuing reading Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. So we had just left off after chapter 11, after our protagonist had arrived in Iceland and had had a bit of conversations with the locals there in search for a grand geological discovery. So we're going to be picking right back up from where we left off in chapter 12, A Barren Land. We started out under a sky that was overcast but calm. There was no fear of heat, nor of disastrous rain. It was just the weather for tourists. The pleasure of riding on horseback through an unknown country made me easy to please as we started off. I devoted myself wholly to the pleasure of the traveler, and enjoyed the feelings of freedom and expectation. I was beginning to feel really involved in the enterprise. Besides, I said to myself, where's the risk? Here we are traveling through a most interesting country. We're about to climb a very remarkable mountain. At worst, we're going to scramble down an extinct crater. It is quite obvious that Signusum did nothing more than this. As for a passage leading to the center of the earth, that's sheer nonsense. Quite impossible. Very well then, let's get all the good we can out of this expedition, and let's not argue about our chance of success. By the time I had come to these conclusions, we had left Reykjavik. Hans moved steadily on, keeping ahead of us at an even, smooth, and rapid pace. The baggage horses followed him without giving any trouble. Then came my uncle and myself, looking not bad horsemen on our small but hardy animals. Iceland is one of the largest islands in Europe. It has a surface area of 14,000 square miles, but only 60,000 inhabitants. Geographers have divided it into four quarters, and we were to cut diagonally across the southwest quarter, called the Sudvester Fjordur. On leaving Reykjavik, Hans led us along the seashore. We passed poor pastures, which were trying very hard, but in vain, to look green. They were yellow at best. The rugged peaks of the Trakic Mountains presented faint outlines on the eastern horizon. Here and there a few patches of snow, concentrating the diffuse light, glittered on the slopes of the distant mountains. Some peaks, riding boldly towards the sky, passed through the gray clouds and reappeared above the moving mists, like rocky reeks emerging in the heavens. Often these chains of barren rocks dipped toward the sea and encroached on the scarce pasture land, but there was always enough room to get by. Besides, our horses instinctively chose the easiest places without ever slackening their pace. My uncle didn't even get the satisfaction of urging his horse on by whip or voice. He had no excuse for impatience. I couldn't help smiling to see so tall a man on so small a pony, and as his long legs nearly touched the ground, he looked like a six-legged centaur. Good horse, he kept saying. You'll see, Axel. There is no more intelligent an animal than the Icelandic horse. Neither snow, nor storms, nor impassable roads, nor rocks, nor glaciers. Nothing stops him. He is courageous, sober, and sure-footed. He never takes a false step, never shies. If there is a river or fjord to cross, and we will meet many, you'll see him plunge in at once, just as if he were amphibious, and reach the opposite bank. But we mustn't hurry him. Let him have his day, and we'll cover a steady 25 miles a day. We may, but how about our guide? Oh, never mind him. People like him stride on without a thought. The man moves so little he'll never get tired. And besides, if he wants it, he can have my horse. I'll get cramps if I don't move him around a bit. My arms are all right, but my legs need exercise. We were progressing at a rapid pace. The country was already almost a desert. Here and there was a lonely farmhouse, a bore, built of wood, turf, and pieces of lava, and looking like a poor beggar by the wayside. These dilapidated huts seemed to be begging for charity from passers-by, and we weren't far off offering alms for the relief of the poor inhabitants. In this country there were no roads and paths, and the poor vegetation, slow growing as it was, would soon cover all trace of the footsteps of the infrequent travelers. Yet this part of the province, only a very small distance from the capital, is reckoned among the inhabited and cultivated parts of Iceland. What then must the other parts be like? Even more deserted than this desert? In the first half mile we hadn't seen a single farmer standing at his cottage door, nor a single wild shepherd tending a flock, rather less wild than he was. Nothing but a few cows and sheep left to themselves. So what would these distorted regions that we were heading for be like? Regions turned upside down by eruptions, born of volcanic explosions and underground convulsions? We were to get to know them before long, but on consulting Olson's map, I saw that there were, for the moment, avoiding them by following a winding route along the seaside. In fact, the main volcanic activity is confined to the central part of the island. There, the horizontal strata of superimposed rocks, called traps in the Scandinavian languages, the trachytic layers, the eruptions of basalt and tufts and agglomerates, the streams of lava and molten porphyry, had made this land of supernatural horrors. I had no idea what sight was awaiting us on Snæfell Peninsula, where the destruction caused by the fiery nature has created frightful chaos. 2 hours after leaving Reykjavik, we arrived at the Kirkja, main church, or village of Gufunes. There was nothing to see here but a few houses, scarcely enough to make a hamlet in Germany. Hans stopped here for half an hour. He shared frugal breakfast with us, answering my uncle's questions about the path with nothing but yes or no. When we asked about our stopping place for the night, he simply replied, Gadair. I consulted the map to see where Gadair was. I saw that there was a small town of that name on the banks of the Fjord, 4 miles from Reykjavik. I showed it to my uncle. Only 4 miles! He exclaimed. 4 miles out of 28. What a pleasant little walk this is. He tried to say something to the guide, but the latter, without answering, took up his place at the head of the horses again and went on his way. 3 hours later, still walking over the colorless grass of the pastureland, we had to work our way round the Fjord. A longer way, but an easier one than straight across the inlet. We soon entered a pingstair, or commune, called Eljulberg, and whose steeple the clock would have been striking 12 if Icelandic churches had been rich enough to have clocks. But they're like their parishioners, who have no watches and manage perfectly well without. There our horses were fed and watered. Then, taking the narrow path to the left between the range of hills and the sea, they carried us to our next stopping point, the Kirkja of Ballantyre, and, 1 mile further on, to Saubor, Annexia, a chapel of ease built on the southern shore of the Fjord. It was now 4 o'clock, and we had gone 4 Icelandic miles. The fjord was at least half an Icelandic mile wide at this point. The waves rolled in and crashed on the sharp-pointed rocks. The inlet widened out between high walls of rock, precipices topped by sharp peaks 2,000 feet high, and remarkable for the brown strata which separated the beds of reddish turf. However much I might respect the intelligence of our horses, I was little inclined to put it to the test by trying to cross an arm of the sea on horseback. If they're as intelligent as they're said to be, I thought, they won't even try it. In any case, I intend to do the thinking for them. But my uncle wouldn't wait. He spurred his horse on down to the water's edge. His mount lowered its head to look at the nearest waves and stopped. My uncle, who had an instinct of his own, applied his spurs again, and again the horse refused, shaking its head. Then came strong language and the whip, but the animal replied to these arguments by kicking and attempting to throw his rider. At last the clever little pony, by bending its knees, got out from under the professor's legs, and left him standing on 2 boulders on the shore like the Colossus of Rhodes. Confounded brute! Cried the unseated rider, suddenly demoted to being a pedestrian, and just as ashamed of it as a cavalry officer would be if downgraded to being a foot soldier. Faria, said the guide, touching him on the shoulder. What? A ferry? There, replied Hans, pointing to one. Yes, I exclaimed. There is a ferry. Why didn't you say so then? Come on, let's go. Is Vatten? Said the guide. What's he saying? He's saying tide, said my uncle, translating the Danish word. So we have to wait for the tide then. Forbida? Asked my uncle. Yeah, replied Hans. My uncle stamped his foot while the horses headed toward the ferry. I perfectly understood the need to wait for a particular point in the tide before undertaking the crossing of the fjord, the point when, the sea having reached its highest level, there would be slack water. At that point, the ebb and flow of the water would have no noticeable effect, and there is no risk of the ferry being carried either to the top of the fjord or out to sea. That favorable moment didn't come till 6 o'clock, at which time my uncle, myself, the guide, two ferrymen, and the four horses entrusted ourselves to a somewhat fragile craft. Accustomed as I was to the steamboats on the Elbe, I found the oars of the rowers a rather slow means of propulsion. It took us more than an hour to cross the fjord, but the crossing was effected without mishap. In another half hour, we had reached the Alqueria of Gadara. All right, up next we have Chapter 13, Hospitality under the Arctic Circle. It should have been dark, but on the 65th parallel there was nothing surprising about the nocturnal polar light. In Iceland, during the months of June and July, the sun never sets. But the temperature had gone down. I was cold, and even more hungry than cold. Welcomed indeed was the sight of the boar, which was hospitably opened to receive us. It was a peasant's house, but as far as hospitality was concerned, it was the equal of a king's palace. On our arrival, the master came out to shake our hands, and, without further ado, beckoned us to follow him inside. Follow him was what we did, because it would have been impossible to walk with him down the long, narrow, dark passage. The building was constructed of roughly squared timbers, and along the passage were 4 rooms: the kitchen, the weaving workshop, the badstofa, or family bedroom, and the visitor's room, which was the best of all. My uncle, whose height had not been taken into consideration in the construction of the house, of course hit his head several times on the beams that projected from the ceiling. We were shown into our bedroom, a large room with a floor of hard-packed earth and lit by a window, the panes of which consisted of sheep's bladders and therefore didn't let in much light. The sleeping accommodation consisted of dry straw thrown into wooden frames which were painted red and decorated with Icelandic sayings. I was hardly expecting so much comfort. The only discomfort came from the strong smell of dried fish, hung meat, and sour milk, which my nose didn't like at all. When we had laid aside our traveling gear, the voice of our host was heard inviting us to come into the kitchen, the only room where a fire was lit, even in the severest cold weather. My uncle wasted no time in obeying this friendly invitation, nor was I slow to follow him. The kitchen chimney was constructed in the ancient style. In the middle of the room there was a stone for a hearth, and over it a hole in the roof to let the smoke escape. The kitchen also served as the dining room. As we came in, the host, as if he had ever seen us before, greeted us with the word "Sel vertu," which means "be happy," and came and kissed us on the cheek. His wife greeted us in the same manner, and then, placing their hands on their hearts, the two bowed deeply. I hasten to say that this Icelandic lady was the mother of 19 children, all of whom, big and little alike, were swarming around in the midst of the dense coils of smoke with which the fire on the hearth was filling the room. At every moment I saw some fair-haired and rather melancholy face emerge from the rolling clouds of smoke. They were a perfect band of unwashed angels. My uncle and I welcomed this little tribe kindly, and in a very short time we each had 3 or 4 of these kids on our shoulders, as many as our laps, and the rest between our knees. Those who could speak kept repeating "Sel vertu" in every conceivable tone. Those that could not speak made up for that lack by shrill cries. This concert was brought to a close by dinner being announced. At that moment our hunter returned. He had been seeing to the horses, which is to say, he had let them loose in the fields, where the poor beasts had to content themselves with the scanty moss they could pull off the rocks and a few meagre clumps of seaweed. The next day they would be sure to come of their own accord and resume the labors of the previous day. "Sel vertu," said Hans. Then, calmly, automatically, and dispassionately, he kissed the host, the hostess, and their 19 children. This ceremony over, we sat at the table, all 24 of us, and therefore literally one on top of another. The luckiest ones among us had only 2 urchins on their knees. But silence reigned in this little world when the soup was served, and the natural taciturnity of the Icelander took over again, even among the children. The host served us soup, made from lichen, by no means unpleasant. Then a huge piece of dried fish, floating in butter that, having been kept for 20 years, had turned rancid, and was therefore, according to Icelandic gastronomy, greatly preferable to fresh butter. Along with this, we had skyr, a sort of clotted milk, flavored with the juice of juniper berries and served with biscuits. And to drink, we had whey mixed with water, known as blanda in this country. It was not for me to say whether this diet is healthy or not. All I can say is that I was desperately hungry, and that when it came to dessert, I swallowed every last mouthful of a thick broth made from buckwheat. As soon as the meal was over, the children disappeared, and their elders gathered round the fire, in which was burning such miscellaneous fuel as peat, heather, cow dung, and fish bones. After warming ourselves a little, the different groups retired to their respective rooms. In accordance with Icelandic custom, our hostess hospitably offered us her assistance in getting undressed, but on our gracefully declining her offer, she didn't insist on it, and I was able at last to curl up in my bed of straw. At 5 in the morning we said good-bye to our host, my uncle only with difficulty managing to persuade him to accept proper payment for his hospitality, and Hans gave the signal for us to start. 100 yards from Gardar, the landscape began to change in appearance. The ground became boggy, and our progress became more difficult. To our right, the chain of mountains stretched out like an immense system of natural fortifications, of which we were following the counterscarp. Often we met with streams, which we had to ford with great care, in order not to get our packs wet. The deserted countryside was becoming more and more of a wasteland, yet from time to time we could make out a human figure, who fled at our approach. Sometimes a sharp turn in the path would bring us suddenly within a short distance of one of these spectres, and I was filled with loathing at the sight of a huge deformed head, with shiny, hairless skin, and repulsive sores visible through the holes in the poor creature's wretched rags. These unhappy beings would not come near us, and offer their misshapen hands. They fled away, but not before Hans greeted them with the customary Selvertu. Spitelsk, Hans would say. A leper, my uncle would repeat. The word always had a repulsive effect. The horrible disease of leprosy is all too common in Iceland. It is not contagious, but hereditary, and lepers are therefore forbidden to marry. These apparitions were not likely to add any charm to the incredibly unattractive landscape. The last tufts of grass had disappeared from beneath our feet. Not a tree was to be seen, unless we except a few dwarf birches, as low as brushwood. Not an animal, but a few wandering ponies that their owners would not feed. Sometimes we could see a hawk gliding through the gray cloud, and then darting away south with rapid flight. I was affected by the melancholy of this wild land, and my thoughts drifted away to the more cheerful scenes I had left far to the south. We had to cross a few narrow fjords, and finally quite a wide bay. It being high tide, we were able to cross without delay, and reached the hamlet of Alftanes a mile further on. That evening, after having forded 2 rivers full of trout and pike, the Alpha and the Heta, we were obliged to spend the night in a deserted building, worthy of being haunted by all the elves of Scandinavia. The Ice King certainly held court there, and all night long showed us what he could do. Nothing of note happened the next day. Just the same bogs, the same monotonous landscape, the same melancholy desert tracks. By nightfall we had covered half the distance we had to travel, and we stopped for the night at the Annexia in Krolsold. On the 19th of June we walked for about a mile, that is, an Icelandic mile, over hardened lava. The ground is called hraun in Iceland. The wrinkled surface has the appearance of distorted, twisted cables, sometimes stretched out lengthwise, sometimes twisted together. An immense torrent of lava, once liquid, now solid, flowed down from the nearest mountains, now extinct volcanoes. But the debris all around us indicated the violence of past eruptions. Here and there were still a few jets of steam from hot springs. We had no time to study these phenomena. We had to continue on our way. Soon the boggy land reappeared under the feet of our horses, interspersed by little lakes. Our route now lay westward. We had made our way round the great bay of Faxa, and the twin peaks of Snæfell rose white into the cloudy sky less than 5 miles away. The horses walked on well. No difficulty stopped them in their steady progress. I was getting tired, but my uncle held himself as stiff and erect as he did when we first started out. I couldn't help admiring his persistence, and that of the hunter, who was treating our expedition as nothing more than a little stroll. On June the 20th, at 6 o'clock, we reached Budir, a village on the seashore. The guide was asking for his wages, and my uncle settled up with him. It was Hans's own family, that is, his uncles and cousins, who gave us hospitality. We were kindly received, and without abusing too much of the goodness of these people, I would willingly have stayed here for a while to recover from my tiring journey. But my uncle, who had no need of time to recover, wouldn't hear it, and the next morning we had to mount our horses again. The soil showed the effects of being close to the mountain, whose granite foundations rose from the earth like the knotted roots of some huge oak. We were going around the immense base of the volcano. The professor hardly took his eyes off it. He waved his arms about and seemed to be challenging it, saying, "There stands the giant that I shall conquer." After about 4 hours walking, the horses stopped of their own accord at the door of the priest's house at Stapi. Up next we have Chapter 14. But but Arctic people can be inhospitable too. Stapi is a village of about 30 huts, built of lava, at the south side of the base of the volcano. It extends along the inner edge of a small fjord, enclosed between basaltic walls of the strangest construction. Basalt is a brownish rock of igneous origin. It assumes regular forms, the arrangement of which is often very surprising. Here nature had done her work geometrically, with set square compasses and the plumb line. Everywhere else her art consists in simply throwing down huge masses together in disorder. You see imperfectly formed cones, irregular pyramids, a strange confusion of lines. But here, as if to exhibit an example of regularity in advance of the very earliest architects, she had created a severely simple order of architecture, never surpassed either by the splendors of Babylon or the wonders of Greece. I had heard of the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, and Fingal's Cave on Staffa, one of the Hebrides, but I had never before seen the basaltic formation. At Stapi I beheld this phenomenon in all its beauty. The wall that held in the fjord, like the whole coast of the peninsula, was composed of a series of vertical columns 30 feet high. These straight shafts, or of perfect proportions, supported an architrave of horizontal slabs, the overhanging portion of which formed a semi-arch over the sea. At intervals, under this natural shelter, vaulted entrances spread out in beautiful curves, into which the waves dashed with foam and spray. A few shafts of basalt, torn from their hold by the fury of storms, lay along the soil like the remains of an ancient temple, in ruins that remain forever fresh, and over which centuries passed without leaving a trace of age upon them. This was the last stage of our journey above ground. Hans had shown great intelligence, and it gave me some little comfort to think then that he was not going to leave us. Upon arriving at the door of the rector's house, which was no different from the others, I saw a man shoeing a horse, hammer in hand, and with a leather apron on. "Selvertu," said the hunter. "God dag," said the blacksmith in good Danish. "Kirkoherd," said Hans, turning to my uncle. "The rector," repeated the professor. "It seems, Axel, that this good man is the rector." Our guide, in the meanwhile, was telling the Kirkoherd what we were doing there. Stopping his work for a moment, the latter shouted something that could no doubt be understood between horses and horse dealers, and immediately a tall, ugly hag of a woman appeared from the hut. She must have been 6 feet tall, or as near as doesn't matter. I was afraid she might treat me to the Icelandic kiss, but thankfully she didn't, nor did she show us into our house with very good grace. The visitor's room seemed to me the worst in the whole hut. It was narrow, dirty, and smelly. But we had to be content with it. The rector obviously did not go in for the old-fashioned hospitality. Far from it. Before the day was over, I saw that we were dealing with a blacksmith, a fisher, a hunter, a joiner, but none at all with the minister of the gospel. To be sure, it was a weekday. Perhaps he made amends on Sundays. I don't mean to say anything against these poor priests, who, after all, are absolutely destitute. They receive a ridiculously small pittance from the Danish government, and from the parish they get a quarter of the tithe, which doesn't amount to 60 marks a year, hence the need to work for their living. But after fishing, hunting, and shoeing horses for any length of time, one soon gets into the ways and manners of fishermen, hunters, and farriers, and other uncultivated people. And that evening I found out that temperance, too, was not among the virtues of our host. My uncle soon discovered what sort of a man he was dealing with. Instead of a good and learned man, he found a rude and coarse peasant. He therefore decided to start out at once on the great expedition and to leave this inhospitable rectory. He cared nothing about fatigue, and resolved to spend the few days in the mountains. The preparations for our departure were therefore made the very day after our arrival at Stapi. Hans hired the services of 3 Icelanders to carry our packs instead of the horses, but as soon as we had arrived at the crater, these men were to turn back and leave us on our own. This was made absolutely clear. My uncle now took the opportunity of explaining to Hans that it was his intention to explore the interior of the volcano to its farthest limits. Hans merely nodded. Heading there or elsewhere, down into the bowels of the earth or anywhere on the surface of the globe, was all the same to him. For my own part, the events of the journey had kept me amused up to this point, and made me forget the evils to come. But now my fears were again beginning to get the better of me. Well, what could I do? The place to stand up to the professor would have been in Hamburg, not at the foot of Snæfell. One thought, above all others, particularly alarmed me, one that would have rattled firmer nerves than mine. Now, I thought, here we are about to climb Snæfell. Fine, we'll explore the crater. That's fine too. Others have done as much without dying for it. But that's not all. If there is a way to penetrate into the bowels of the island, if what that foolish Saknussemm said is true, we will lose our way among the deep subterranean passages of this volcano. Now, there's no proof that Snæfell is extinct. Who can reassure us that an eruption is not brewing at this very moment? Does it follow that just because the monster has slept since 1229, it will therefore never wake again? And if it does awaken in the near future, where shall we be? It was worthwhile considering this question, and I did consider it. I couldn't sleep for dreaming about eruptions. I had no desire to play the role of ejected scoriae and ashes. So, at last, when I couldn't stand it any longer, I made up my mind to put the question to my uncle, as prudently as cautiously as possible, in the form of an almost impossible hypothesis. I approached him. I communicated my fears to him, and stepped back, to give him room for the explosion which I knew would follow. But I was wrong. All he said was, "I was thinking of that." What could these words mean? Was he actually going to listen to reason? Was he contemplating abandoning his plans? This was too good to be true. After a few moments' silence, during which I dared not question him, he went on. "I was thinking of that. Ever since we arrived at Stapi, my mind has been occupied with the important question you have just raised, because we mustn't be guilty of imprudence." "No, indeed," I implied emphatically. "For 600 years Snæfell has been silent, but it might speak again. Now, eruptions are always preceded by certain well-known phenomena. I have therefore questioned the locals, I have studied the land, and I can assure you, Axel, there will be no eruption." At this positive assertion, I just stood there, amazed and speechless. "You doubt my word?" said my uncle. "Well then, follow me." I obeyed like an automaton. Leaving the priest's house, the professor took a straight path, which led away from the sea through an opening in the basaltic wall. We were soon in the open countryside, if one may give that name to a vast expanse of mounds of volcanic material. This part of the country seemed to have been crushed by a rain of enormous rocks. Trap, basalt, granite, and all kinds of igneous rock, thrown out by the volcano. Here and there, I could see curling up into the air puffs and jets of steam, called in Icelandic rector, issuing from the thermal springs and indicating by their movement the volcanic energy below. This seemed to justify my fears, but my newfound hopes were dashed when my uncle said, "You see the plumes of steam, Axel? Well, they show that we have nothing to fear from the fury of a volcanic eruption." "Why should I believe that?" I exclaimed. "Listen," said the professor. "If there's an eruption coming, these jets redouble their activity. But they disappear altogether during the eruption, because the gases, no longer under pressure, are released through the crater, instead of escaping by their normal passage through the fissures in the soil. Therefore, if these vapors remain in their usual state and show no increase in force, and if you add this to the observation that the wind and rain are not being replaced by a still heavy atmosphere, then you may say with certainty that no eruption is coming in the near future. But that's enough. When science has spoken, there is nothing more to be said. I returned to the parsonage, completely crestfallen. My uncle had bested me with the weapons of science. Still, I had one hope left, and this was that when we reached the bottom of the crater it would be impossible, for lack of a way through, to go deeper, in spite of all the Signusums in Ireland. That whole night was one long nightmare. I saw myself in the heart of a volcano, and thrown up like a rock from the deepest depths of the earth into interplanetary space. The next day, June the 23rd, Hans was sitting for us with his companions, carrying provisions, tools, and scientific instruments. There were also 2 iron tip sticks, 2 rifles, and 2 cartridge belts for my uncle and myself. Hans, as a cautious man, had added to our luggage a leather bottle full of water, which, with what was in our flasks, would ensure us a supply of water for 8 days. It was 9 in the morning. The priest and his huge harpy of a wife were waiting for us at the door. We thought they were standing there to bid us a kind farewell, but the farewell came in the unexpected form of a large bill, in which we were charged for everything, even the very air we breathed in the pastoral house, foul as it was. This worthy couple were fleecing us, just like a Swiss innkeeper might have done, and reckoned their inadequate hospitality at a very high price. My uncle paid without demur. A man who is starting out for the center of the earth is hardly going to quibble over a few rix dollars. This matter settled, Hans gave the signal to set off, and soon we left Stapi behind us. Okay, so we are going right along into this lovely novel. And we are, in the next couple of chapters, really going to be picking up. Chapter 15 is called Snaefell at Last, and we'll get to see, finally, what Axel and Otto will discover at the center of this volcanic crater. Until then, I'll see you next time. Thank you very much.